The same medals my father earned bleeding through the Korean winter were hanging in my brother's garage, right beside a neon Budweiser sign and a mounted largemouth bass. And the second I saw that, something inside me went completely still. Not angry, not crying, still. Like the moment before a storm when every bird goes quiet and the air just stops moving. That's when I knew. I was done protecting him. My name is Lenora Whitaker. I'm 62 years old, and I live in a small house in Mercer County, Pennsylvania, about 40 minutes from where I grew up. There's a Dollar General nearby, a diner called Patty's that still serves coffee in those old foam cups, and a VFW hall on Elm Street where my father used to sit every Saturday morning with men who understood things the rest of the world had quietly forgotten. I am a divorced woman. I drive a 10-year-old Chevy with a busted passenger window crank. And for the last 4 years of my father's life, I was the only one who showed up. His name was Harold Whitaker, Korean War veteran. He was quiet the way good men are quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he believed words should mean something before you spent them. He kept his medals in a flat wooden box lined with faded blue velvet, the kind of box that smells like cedar and old leather. He'd take them out maybe twice a year, Veterans Day, and the anniversary of the chosen reservoir, which he never talked about in detail, but which sat behind his eyes every single November. He'd lay them on the kitchen table, have his black coffee, and just look at them. Sometimes I'd sit with him. We didn't need to say much. Those last years were hard ones. The oxygen tank came first, then the nighttime coughing that would shake the whole back bedroom. I learned to sleep light. I kept his medications sorted in one of those plastic weekly organizers, morning pills on the left, evening on the right, and I checked it every single day without being asked. I drove him to his appointments at the VA in Pittsburgh, sat with him in those waiting rooms under fluorescent lights at 7 in the morning, brought him meatloaf on Tuesdays because that was the one meal that still made him eat like he meant it. He'd watch the football in his old recliner with a blanket on his lap and the sound turned up too loud, and I'd sit in the kitchen reading or paying his bills, and that was our life together. Small. Ordinary. And I would not trade 1 hour of it. My brother Dean visited 4 times in those 4 years. I counted. Once when Dad first got the oxygen tank, Dean stayed 2 days and spent most of it on his phone. Twice around the holidays, both times fewer than 24 hours. And once about 8 months before Dad passed, when he brought a buddy of his to see the old man, like Dad was some kind of attraction. He called himself a patriot. Had a flag decal on his truck and everything. Never once changed a blanket. Never once sat in a hospital waiting room. Never once heard our father cough through a wall at 3 in the morning and wondered if this was the night. Dad passed on a Tuesday in March. Quiet, the way he lived. I was there. I held his hand. And if you've ever sat quietly at a family table while being treated like you mattered less, subscribe to this channel. Because people our age know something younger folks don't. Sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from strangers. They come from family. The gathering after the funeral was at my mother's house, the same house I grew up in, same brown carpet, same smell of old coffee and mentholated rub. People brought casseroles. Someone put the local news on low in the corner. My mother moved through the rooms accepting condolences with the composure of a woman who has always cared more about appearances than feelings, which is a harsh thing to say and also entirely true. I was standing near the kitchen when Dean made his announcement. He didn't lower his voice. He never did. He said, and I will remember these exact words until the day I die, he said, Dad would have wanted me to have the medals. I'm the son. Just like that. Casual. Like he was calling dibs on a parking spot. My mother nodded immediately. Didn't pause. Didn't look at me. Just nodded and said, Of course. That makes sense. And the room, full of cousins, neighbors, people from our father's church, just let it happen. Nobody said a word. I looked around that room and felt something I can only describe as a slow erasure. 4 years of my life, and I was standing there invisible. What I didn't know yet was that Dean had already taken the box. Before the service even ended. He'd gone into Dad's bedroom while the rest of us were at the graveside, and he'd taken that flat cedar box and put it in the back of his truck like it was a bag of old tools. Tell me in the comments, would you have stayed quiet? Or would you finally stand up for yourself after years of this? I read every single one, because stories like this hit close to home for a lot of good people. I drove home alone that evening, heated up some leftover potato soup, sat at my kitchen table in the quiet. Dad's recliner was still in my living room. I'd had it moved to my house the year before when he couldn't use the stairs anymore, and I couldn't look at it. I listened to a voicemail he'd left me once, from about 2 years ago, where he'd called to tell me the Steelers won and to ask if I wanted him to save me some of the chili he'd made. He was proud of that chili. His voice sounded like gravel and warm wool, and I played that message 3 times and then sat there in the silence of my kitchen and let myself come apart for a while. But I didn't stay apart long. I've never been built that way. My cousin Ruth Ann called me 9 days later. She'd been over at Dean's house for a birthday thing for her son. She said she walked into his garage and stopped cold. The medals were mounted on the wall. Not in the cedar box. Mounted between a neon beer sign and some fishing poles. One of them, the one with the purple ribbon, had a dark smudge on it, like it had been handled without care and set near something greasy. I drove to Dean's house the next morning. Didn't call first. Knocked on the side door by the garage. He answered in a flannel shirt, coffee in hand, surprised but not worried. I told him I wanted to see the medals. He shrugged and led me in. I stood there and looked at my father's service to this country hanging on a pegboard between a Coors Light mirror and a mounted base. And Dean leaned against his workbench and said, "I swear on my father's grave," he said. "Relax, Lenora. They're just old metal. Just old metal." I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I said, "Okay," and I left. Stay with me, because what happened 3 nights later changed everything. My brother thought he'd won. He had no idea the worst was still coming. I went home and I thought about something my father told me once, a few months before the end. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the medals laid out, snow falling outside the window. He said, "Lenora, those medals belong to history. Not to selfish people. History." I'd thought at the time he was just being philosophical. He wasn't. He was telling me something. I started making calls. First I spoke with the county sheriff's office and explained that property belonging to my father's estate had been removed without authorization before the estate was legally settled. Then I contacted the Pennsylvania Veterans Affairs Office. Then, and this part took some patience and a lot of time on hold, I reached someone at a military archives office in D.C. who deals with veteran property and records. I was polite. I was clear. I had documentation, photos of the medals from old family pictures, a letter Dad had written years ago listing his commendations, and the estate filing that showed nothing had been legally transferred. If you enjoy stories where the quiet person finally stops taking abuse, subscribe. Because too many decent people spend their whole lives protecting the ones who hurt them. Dean was having some men over. Cards, probably some beers in the garage, the usual Saturday night. The sheriff's deputies arrived around 8:30. Neighbors were out. Porch lights were on. 2 officers, very professional, very respectful, explained to my brother that the items on his wall were subject to an estate dispute and needed to be secured pending investigation. They removed the medals carefully. 1 officer wore gloves. Dean stood there in front of his friends with his mouth open. His face went the color of old ash. He called my mother. She called me. She said, "How could you do this to your own brother?" Her voice was shaking. I said, "He embarrassed Dad. I just stopped protecting him." And I hung up. Here's what nobody expected. When the Veterans Affairs Office examined the medals, their records flagged something significant. One of the commendations, the one with a dark smudge on it, had been quietly earmarked years ago for a regional military history museum, a designation my father had agreed to in writing before his health declined. It was part of a larger Veterans Legacy program, and Dean, by removing it and storing it improperly in a garage, had nearly damaged a piece of documented military history. The cousins found out. The neighbors found out. The men from the VFW found out. My brother went from being the proud son to the man who almost destroyed an irreplaceable piece of American veteran history so he could decorate his garage. Folks our age were raised to keep the peace, even when keeping it destroyed us quietly from the inside. But sometimes peace just becomes permission for bad people to keep hurting you. My father knew that. He just couldn't say it directly. So he said it the only way he knew how. He trusted me. In late May, the Veterans Museum held a small ceremony honoring my father's service. They displayed the medals in a proper case, with his name and regiment and the dates of his service. I was invited. I wore the blue dress I'd bought for his retirement party 20 years ago. It still fit. There were older veterans there, men in their 80s with careful movements and steady eyes. One of them, a man named Walt who had served in Korea himself, took my hand after the ceremony and said, "Your father would be proud of you." Just that. Nothing extra. The way good men talk. I stood there holding a folded program with my father's photograph on it, and I thought about all the nights I spent awake in that back bedroom, all the foam cups of coffee in waiting rooms, all the Tuesdays I brought meatloaf, all the mornings I counted pills and checked oxygen levels and sat in the quiet so he wouldn't be alone in it. I thought about a man who believed words should mean something before you spent them. And if you've made it this far with me tonight, thank you for spending these minutes here. Now let me tell you the part my brother never saw coming. My silence was never weakness. It was patience. There is a difference. He never understood that. Most people who take and take and take never do. My brother inherited my father's last name. But I inherited his honor. Dean doesn't come to family things much anymore. I have my father's old voicemail saved on my phone. I have a photograph of him from 1951, 20 years old in his uniform, standing straight as a fence post. I have the memory of an old man's hand in mine on a Tuesday in March. Some people spend their whole lives chasing what they think they deserve. Others just show up, do the work, and trust that the truth is patient. My father taught me that. Turns out he was right. If this story touched your heart even a little, subscribe and come back tomorrow night. Because sadly, this wasn't the only thing my family did to me. And I have a feeling some of you understand exactly what that means.